This is lecture number 29B in the series ABCs of Communism on YouTube, based on the text that's in next year's ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2016 12th edition that will be available at the end of the year. When we stopped last time, we had just gotten to the point where the Kennedy administration has decided to launch Eisenhower-Nixon attack on Cuba. And they had begun on April 9th when Rolando Masfer, a former Batista official, was indicted in Miami for an attack on Cuba violating the Neutrality Act, an aborted invasion of Cuba the previous October 4th. And the idea was to fool the Cubans into believing the U.S. was changing policy under Kennedy about an imminent invasion. And as I pointed out, the idiots and the CIA, as usual, did not realize that they were thoroughly penetrated, and Fidel and his leadership group knew every step these fumble-bums were taking. On April 13th, another bomb went off that destroyed Cuba's finest department store, the El Encanto. Then on April 15th, President Kennedy launches the Bay of Pigs operation when 8 B-26 bombers attack airfields at Ciudad Libertad in Havana, and San Antonio de los Baños, in Pinar del Rio, and Santiago de Cuba, in an attempt to destroy all of Cuba's air force, which they pretty much did. A second wave of attacks by these B-26 bombers designed to wipe out any surviving aircraft was canceled because Raul Roa was screaming at the United Nations about the Gringo attack, and anyway the CIA thought they had destroyed Castro's air force, and indeed they had, except for 6 planes that were now assembled outside Havana at the airport. Fidel was out there sleeping on a cot with the pilots of these 6 planes. 5 of these were propeller-driven planes. 1 was a jet trainer that they had managed to get rockets installed upon. And they were waiting for these invasion ships to show up. They knew they were on their way. When they did, these 5 prop planes and 1 jet trainer, outfitted with rocket weapons, took off and sunk the CIA ships one after the other. And eventually these ships just turned around and ran, the ones that were still afloat. I had become aware of this plot earlier while in military intelligence in Vicenza, Italy in early 1961, and I had telephoned Frank Church in Washington to tell him what I had learned, and what I had learned after my return from the U.S. to the U.S. from Frank Church was that he had immediately gone to see JFK and his brother RFK and asked if this were true. And if it were true, what was the probability that an invasion of Cuba like this would not be known to the Russians and the Cubans if a private soldier in Italy knew about it? For the details of this episode, see the first volume of my autobiography entitled The Buccaneer in the autobiographical series Ido Smith's Search for the Foundation. In Guatemala, President Eisenhower authorized the training of 5,000 anti-Castro Cubans. He had also provided airstrips in the region of Petén for what later became the U.S.-sponsored failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. And you'll recall that Anastasio Somoza had also provided them with a base. Eisenhower's government was ousted in 1963 when the Guatemalan Air Force attacked several military bases, and the coup there was led by his defense minister, Enrique Peralta. CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs at a place in Cuba called Playa Girón. The invasion ended 3 days later in the exiles' defeat by the Cuban army. These gusanos were cowardly, and they would not fight when they came up against stiff small farmer militia. These militia held them at the cost of their lives until Fidel could get there with regular Cuban army tanks and troops. These mercenaries, being cowards, gave up and threw down their arms and went into prisoner of war status. On April 19th, Castro announced that the revolution is socialist in Havana. And in Havana, clear traitors like Humberto Sorin Marin, Manuel Puig, and Rogelio Gonzalez Corso were shot. The common mercenary soldiers of the Kennedy gang were being held for the U.S. to claim, and JFK would later be made to pay reparations to Cuba for the damages they had caused in exchange for their return to the U.S. On May 1st, Castro declared that Cuba is a socialist country and that Cuba is now in the World Socialist camp. In the aftermath, we know a great deal about what happened at Playa Giron Beach, the Bay of Pigs, when Castro's 5 propeller planes and 1 jet trainer engaged the invader force in the Bay of Pigs. I knew a great deal more about the invasion plot than others at the time because I had come across evidence for the Cuban invasion just weeks before it came to pass, as I have recounted in Volume 1 of my autobiographical series, Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation, entitled The Buccaneer. The printed version of these books is now available at some libraries, despite U.S. government sabotage of the mass mailing I did of those books. These books in the libraries where they are can be found by going to WorldCat, that is www.worldcat.com. The second edition of these books is in ebook form at Kindle Books, www.amazon.com, all for $2.99, which is the lowest price Amazon will let me put on them. And at any rate, before I had departed the USA by air for U.S. Army military intelligence in Europe in the spring of 1960, I had visited U.S. Senator Frank Church, Democrat, Idaho, one last time. I had been visiting him frequently during my time at the U.S. Army Intelligence Training School, USAINTS, at Fort Holabird, Baltimore, Maryland, in his office in Washington, D.C. That school was subsequently packed up and moved to New Mexico, in part because of what I had done while I was at Fort Holabird, another story for another time. At any rate, the last thing Senator Church had asked me to do during that visit was to contact him if I should learn anything about what was in the U.S. press at that time about a coming U.S. invasion, a plot against Cuba. That conversation had occurred a year earlier, and therefore a year before the invasion actually took place. Eisenhower had been president then, and JFK still a relatively unknown, at least to us in Idaho, U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. In other words, then it had been the Republicans in power. I didn't know if Church would still want to hear about the invasion plot, now that JFK was the U.S. president, and the Democrats had inherited Nixon's and Ike's plan to invade Cuba. However, I was honor-bound to honor my promise that I would let him know if I should learn anything about the plot. What I had learned happened in this way. A fellow graduate of the USAINTS course in intelligence analysis named Vince Wetzler from Spokane, Washington, had been assigned to CTAF G2 in Verona, Italy. This was at the same time I had been sent to the S2 of the Corporal Missile Base the U.S. maintained in Vicenza, Italy. We traveled from Frankfurt, Germany via Alitalia to Milano, Italy, and then took a train to Verona, where Vince got off while I went on to Vicenza. Vince and I stayed in touch and visited one another off and on over the next year to take in the sights in both of these famous towns. One day Vince had called me and told me he had something he wanted me to know, but I had to come to Verona to find out. So I did as requested, taking a Fiat Spider sports car belonging to a friend of ours on the Vicenza Post, who lent it to me. In Verona, I learned from Vince at the Juliet Castle Bar about a young soldier at a secret U.S. Army Raider base located in the mountains near Verona. And that this soldier had information about the upcoming invasion of Cuba that I had always been interested in, and Vince knew I was, that he was willing to give me. So I had been to this base before by helicopter as part of my S2 duties, and I knew it was highly secret, heavily secured and guarded. I made my way to the agreed-upon meeting spot and parked waiting for the contact to appear. Eventually he emerged from the forest. This turned out to be a place where local soldiers stationed at the Raider base sneaked off to meet Italian girls. The essence of what he told me was that he had been training Raiders in basic electronics. When I inquired as to why these killers would need to know about Ohm's law, he explained that they were being trained to seize communications equipment in radio and television stations. What had him concerned was that most of the training had to do with sophisticated TV stations that did not even exist in Cuba and were now and were new in the USA. In short, he thought it was part of a plot that envisaged a military coup d'etat against the government of the United States. Now, such a thing had never occurred to me at that time, and I thought this kid had an overly active imagination. I had not yet read 7 Days in May, or of course seen the movie. I have published all of this before in the aforementioned volume 1 of my autobiography entitled The Buccaneer, so if you want to read more of the details, you can get that book from a library near you or from Kindle Books. On my way back to Vicenza, I realized I was honor bound to call Senator Church, tell him what this soldier had said. The only secure way at that time to do this was to go to the Italian Central Telephone Exchange for Vicenza, which was located in the railroad train station. ASA, Army Security Agency, had the entire officer and NCO telephone network in Vicenza bugged. A daily report with the contents of those calls was sent to our commanding officer, Colonel Coffin, who commanded our base, and to get it to him, these top secret reports, mainly juicy conversations of Army wives about their daily lives, they were routinely sent through HE Classified, which is to say sent through me, because my job at the time was in this HE Classified vault I was locked into during the daily working hours. Well, it took up to 9 hours in those days to get a call from Italy through to Idaho, so I knew it would take some time to get one through to Washington, D.C. Eventually, I was able to work this out, and the call was made. I did not know until I returned to the U.S. what Church had done with the information. When I got back, he told me that he had immediately called President Kennedy for an appointment and went right to the White House. And even though Church was the youngest senator to be seated in the U.S. Senate, and still very much the junior senator from Idaho, he was part of the in-group at the White House. He had nominated JFK at the 1960 Democratic Convention in Los Angeles, and he had been active in every aspect of the successful campaign that whipped Tricky Dick Nixon. He told me that he had asked JFK if it was true that an invasion was forthcoming against Cuba, and if it was true and a private soldier in Italy knows about it, what are the chances that the Cubans and Russians don't know? Will they be waiting for them on the beaches? He said that JFK had called for his brother, his Attorney General of the United States at that time, to listen to this, and JFK responded that yes, there was an invasion, and the CIA was training the invaders. However, he said it was to be solely a Cuban operation, and the CIA had hands off, as did he. Frank Church responded that it looked to him like the CIA was planning to use U.S. soldiers along with the Cuban invaders they had trained. In other words, the CIA knew that the Cuban force alone would be insufficient, and that they were getting him into a position where he would be forced to authorize U.S. troops to keep up the invasion from being defeated. I suspect in retrospect this is one of the reasons that the second strike against Castro's Air Force was called off. JFK said if he thought that was happening, he would break the CIA up and throw it to the four winds. As for the other part about a plot to seize the U.S. government, he didn't even want to consider that. When the CIA would later ask for a follow-up strike on Cuban installations to support the first strikes that had indeed wiped out most of Fidel's Air Force, JFK refused, in part because he'd been made aware just days before by Frank Church of the possible CIA plan to force his hand, in part because Raul Roa at the UN had exposed the U.S. hand in the airstrikes by using photographs provided by the U.S. government itself of supposed Cuban aircraft that had defected from Castro and were now fighting for the Gusano force. Roa showed that the Cuban B-29s had the wrong kind of nose to be in the Cuban Air Force and were only used in the U.S. Air Force. The CIA stumblebums had done it again and fucked themselves in the ass. The CIA did not know immediately about my hand in this expose, but it soon would. Another story I've already told in The Buccaneer. We know now that the Kennedys did not give up on the objective of overthrowing the Fidelista government in Cuba because the Joint Chiefs insisted upon it. They were all acting to satisfy the U.S. oligarchy of ruling billionaire families led by George H.W. Bush at this point. Accordingly, on November 30th, 1961, President Kennedy approved Operation Mongoose. This was the new covert CIA plan to get rid of Castro. His brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was to lead the effort. In the end, these mongoose killers would be used in the plot of George H.W. Bush to kill JFK and later his brother. The Bush gang had Vietnam in their sights, as well as Cuba, and eventually, of course, China and Russia. They had to be rid of JFK and put in LBJ to get their way. Again, let me strongly suggest that you watch Francis Richard Connolly's YouTube video entitled From JFK to 9/11, Everything is a Rich Man's Trick. For the most recent details on the George H.W. Bush organized assassination of JFK, this 3.5-hour long YouTube video is the best. But first, the Gringo cabal had to give one more roll of the dice to rid Cuba of the revolutionary government. And this roll of the dice would bring the world to the brink of World War III, and its failure would ensure the death of JFK. World War III. The 1962 Gringo invasion is thwarted. The imperialists would not give up on the idea of destroying the Cuban rebel base for the eventual liberation of Latin America and indeed the colonial world. They decided to attack Cuba with the full force of their military. This could have led to World War III, and many imperialist chieftains were willing to fight that war now, before the end of 1962, regardless of the consequences to the North American population. The Cuban leaders were likewise ready to fight that war now, regardless of the consequences to the Cuban people. The Soviets were willing to fight that war if they had to, also. However, for them, the consequences of World War were already too well ingrained from the last one to travel this path without trying to avert that war if possible. With IRBMs, that is intermediate range ballistic missiles, in place in Cuba, the Soviets, would have a bargaining chip to secure Cuba from U.S. attack, and in so doing secure themselves from the consequences of atomic war. In the end, the Soviets prevailed in saving Cuba permanently from U.S. invasion, and in preventing thermonuclear holocaust on their socialist world camp. Public tensions between imperialism and Cuba grew steadily during 1962. In the United States, everyone was aware that only war against Cuba could satisfy the warmongers. This time, the Gringo regime was preparing an all-out assault on Cuba, featuring the use of 100,000 U.S. Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen. It was circumvented by the Soviet installation of medium-range IRBM nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. When Kennedy found out, he blockaded Cuba, and the October Cuban Missile Crisis was on, what's often called the Caribbean Crisis in Cuba. Strategically, in case of World War III, the United States had a much larger arsenal of long-range nuclear weapons, ICBMs, than the Soviet Union, and it had a base of medium-range ballistic missiles the U.S. had in Turkey. On the other hand, the Soviet Union had a large number of medium-range nuclear missiles, IRBMs, and long-range artillery located in Europe. Now it had IRBMs in Cuba. In the event of war, one side could do as much damage to the other as the other could deliver to it. It was the beginning of a global shift towards great power bipolarity that would not be reversed. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russian government revealed that nuclear-tipped Frog, tactical artillery, and Ilyushin Il-28 bombers with hydrogen bombs had also been deployed in Cuba. The Gringo invasion would have been met with tactical atomic warheads on the beaches and bombers with hydrogen bombs heading for Miami and other staging areas of the invasion force. Cuba agreed to let the Soviets place SS-4 Sandal and SS-5 Skeen IRBMs on their territory. Both sides agreed that the installation would have to be concealed, so that by the time the imperialists found out about it, the missiles would be operational and it would be a fait accompli, or it would be war. Reports from inside Cuba, from the remaining cadre of traitors, led to the discovery of the missiles in September '62. When they were confirmed by Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance photos, JFK responded by establishing a cordon in international waters to stop Soviet ships from bringing in more missiles, which he designated a quarantine rather than a blockade to avoid issues with international law. Subsequently, the Soviet agent who had earlier run the Rosenbergs, a legal Chekist now in the Soviet embassy in Washington, brokered a last-minute deal between Khrushchev and JFK. As Soviet ships carrying more weapons cargo at the last moment reversed course and sailed home, this was the key turning point as part of the Khrushchev-Kennedy deal. The U.S. agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey, and the Russians agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba. Most importantly, the United States promised it would never, ever again attempt to invade Cuba in the future. Fidel was left out of these negotiations, in which Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. commitment not to invade Cuba, and understanding that the U.S. would remove their intermediate-range ballistic missiles from Turkey and Italy. This because of the last-minute agreement negotiated in Washington with the aforementioned Chekist as the go-between, who has written a book about it, by the way. I think he calls it something like the man who that managed the Rosenbergs, which was him. But at any rate, so it's well worth reading if you're interested in these years. Well, feeling betrayed by Khrushchev, Fidel was furious. When the head of the United Nations flew to Havana, Fidel refused to let him get off the plane, turned him around, and sent him back. He said, nobody's going to inspect Cuba without our permission. Well, Raúl explained to Fidel that they had best use the historic opportunity to get the Soviet Union to supply everything the revolution was going to need to build industrial Cuba. And in the end, that is what happened. In April 1963, Fidel visited the USSR and received a massive outpouring of enthusiastic Russians cheering him on as he toured 14 cities. He addressed a Red Square rally, and Khrushchev awarded him both the Order of Lenin, and Moscow State University awarded him an honorary doctorate. When Fidel returned to Cuba with new ideas, many new ideas, he was so impressed by the Soviet newspaper Pravda, which means truth, that upon returning to Havana, he suggested to the revolution the amalgamation of the Communist Party newspaper Hoy, which is Spanish for today, and the 26th of July movement newspaper Revolucion, into a new daily called Granma, Granma. Granma today publishes an online edition in 5 languages, including English, and I read it every day. Fidel came back with lots of money. Cuba was able to expand its medical, educational facilities and undertake such things as large-scale investment into Cuban sports at schools across the Republic. This would eventually increase Cuba's international sporting reputation. In addition, in 1963, the Guatemalan junta, installed by the CIA in 1954, called an election in which it permitted Arevalo to return from exile and contest that election. However, a coup from within the military, backed by the Kennedy administration, prevented the election from taking place and forestalled a likely victory for Arevalo. The new regime intensified the campaign of terror against the guerrillas that had begun under Idígoras. Now this time the rebel base area in Cuba would be able to get some payback for the Idígoras conspiracy with the CIA over the Bay of Pigs invasion. More importantly, it would assist the growing insurgency of the Mayan peoples against the fascist regime in Guatemala City, exposing and defeating imperialist vanguards of subversion. In 1963, the Cuban government cracked down on Protestant sects in Cuba as counter-revolutionary instruments of imperialism. Now, for years, gringo strategists in Washington had used Protestant preachers from outfits with such names as the Summer Institute of Linguistics, as well as professors of anthropology in such endeavors as the Vicos and Camelot projects of the CIA, all of which you can look up now, and there's lots of information about their actual activities online. In later years, the CIA concentrated its espionage and subversion via the USAID program. It was easier for them to control than the anthropological fronts, where professors often caught on what was going on. Even so, scum like John Howland Rowe continued as willing counter-revolutionary agents, robbing Peru of its antiquities and helping the CIA to establish bases in Latin America. In Cuba, beginning in 1963, the General Direction of Intelligence, the DGI, was able to uncover such guises, and their agents operating in Cuba were found guilty of illegal U.S. links. The government was able to end youth unemployment, tackled initially with an Army draft law, wherein otherwise unemployable youth learned crafts ranging from welding to carpentry. As quickly as the government could, vocational and professional schools, free, were established for any qualified person. And this all happens within the first few years, so that the youth unemployment problem was resolved. And the government encouraged bourgeois immigration. In September 1963, the government temporarily permitted immigration for anyone other than males aged between 15 and 26. This had the highly desirable effect of ridding the government of thousands of petty bourgeois enemies, most of whom were from upper and middle class backgrounds, although native criminal elements, such as portrayed in Oliver Stone's Scarface, Tony Montana et al., ended up in Florida too as part of the Mariel boat lift later on. Well, in 1963, the Castro brothers' mother died. She had long ago disowned both of her sons for being communists. Now the only family Fidel and Raul had was with their new wives. Fidelita, Fidel's son by Mirta Diaz-Balart, who had divorced him while he was in prison at the Isle of Pines, was being raised in Miami. When the boy came of age, he would return to Cuba as a patriot, and by this time he had earned a PhD in physics. Back in the USSR, in January 1964, Fidel returned to Moscow, this time to sign a new 5-year sugar trade agreement and to discuss the ramifications of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The Soviets and Fidel Castro knew that the assassination had been part of a far-right conspiracy. One of the possibilities was that the LBJ regime would try to blame them for it. The conspiracy against Kennedy itself immediately began to come apart, as Mark Lane points out in his classic book, Rush to Judgment. Afterwards, Jim Garrison, the district attorney for New Orleans, charged Clay Shaw with masterminding the details of the assassination and brought him to trial. He and his case were immortalized in the Oliver Stone classic film JFK. This matter is beyond the scope of this section. For the best modern reconstruction of the conspiracy, you should watch YouTube video by Francis Richard Connolly, JFK to 9/11, Everything is a Rich Man's Trick. Despite the clear evidence of the conspiracy, the Gringo regime sticks to its story even to this very day. The Cuban Communist Party reformed. We reviewed the origin of the Cuban Communist Party in Chapter 31 when Michael Broden arrived in Havana Harbor at the end of December 1919, and he kicked it off as the official Comintern-affiliated Communist Party of Cuba. You know that the Cuban Communists had taken on the name Partido Socialista Popular, Popular Socialist Party, or PSP, in 1944 for electoral reasons. In 1962, the PSP had merged with the 26th of July movement and the Revolutionary Directorate to form the Integrated Revolutionary Organization, or ORI. Then in March of 1962, the ORI became the United Party of the Socialist Revolution, PURSC. In October 1965, the PURSC became officially renamed the Communist Party of Cuba, having acquired its original Comintern name again. The revolution supports national liberation struggles as the primary focus of foreign policy. Fidel continued calling for global revolution, and wherever possible, Cuba was supporting those engaged in national liberation struggles. Cuba's foreign policy was staunchly anti-imperialist. The Cuban leadership was united in believing that every nation should control its own natural resources. Cuba supported the African liberation struggles and sent Che Guevara to the Congo. After Guevara returned to Cuba to refocus on the liberation of Latin America, Cuba continued to support revolutionary groups globally, including as much aid as possible was being sent to Vietnam in its struggle against U.S. imperialism. Cuba supported Che Guevara's Andean project to set up a guerrilla movement in the highlands of Bolivia. He intended to lead the liberation of South America beginning in the Altiplano of Bolivia, Peru, and Argentina. The rebel base is proactive. Imperialism is frightened and determined to strike back. Cuba did what it could to help the fight for freedom, ranging from Vietnam and the National Liberation Front there in the U.S. puppet state of South Vietnam to the USA itself and their Black Panthers. He was training these fighters at home in Cuba. Since Western-dominated Africa was ripe for revolution, Cuba sent troops and medics to aid Ahmed Ben Bella's socialist regime in Algeria. Cuba allied with Alphonse Mesamba de Bat's socialist government in Congo-Brazzaville. In 1965, Castro authorized Guevara to travel to Congo-Kinshasa to train revolutionaries against the U.S.-backed government. In 1966, Julio Cesar Méndez Montenegro was elected president of Guatemala under the banner Democratic Opening. Méndez Montenegro was the candidate of the Revolutionary Party, a center-left party that had its origins in the post-Ubico period, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture on Guatemala. During this time, rightist and paramilitary organizations such as the White Hand, Mano Blanca, and the anti-communist secret army, Ejército Secreto Anticomunista, were formed. Those groups were the forerunners of the famous death squads. Military advisors from the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, were sent to Guatemala to train these troops and help transform its army into a modern counterinsurgency force, which eventually made it the most sophisticated in Central America. Cubans were devastated when Guevara was murdered by CIA-organized fascist troops in Bolivia in October 1967. In 1966, Cuba organized the Tricontinental Conference of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in Havana. This established the Cuban rebel base as a major force on the world stage. From this conference, Cuba created the Latin American Solidarity Organization, OLAS, which adopted the slogan of, quote, "The duty of revolution is to make revolution," unquote, demonstrating Havana's leadership of Latin America's revolutionary movement. The Anibal Escalante coup attempt. Cuba's increasing role on the world stage strained its relationship with the USSR, now under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev. Asserting Cuba's independence, Fidel refused to sign the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, declaring it a Soviet-U.S. attempt to dominate the Third World. Diverting from Soviet doctrine, Fidel suggested that Cuban society could evolve straight to pure communism, rather than progressing through various stages of socialism. In turn, Soviet loyalist Anibal Escalante began organizing a government network of opposition to the Fidel Castro leadership. This was a continuation of their policy sabotaging Che Guevara's Liberation of South America project that led to his capture and murder. In January 1968, Escalante and his supporters were arrested for allegedly passing state secrets to Moscow. This is only a few months after Guevara's capture and murder in Bolivia. Brezhnev backs off. However, Fidel Castro in August of '68 denounced the leaders of the Prague Spring and praised the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. Soviet leader Brezhnev realized how much he depended upon the Cuban rebel base for legitimacy and began to back off of Cuba and on attempts to rid the world socialist camp of the Cuban base area. Cuba supported China's Great Leap Forward, and emulating it in 1968, Cuba proclaimed a Great Revolutionary Offensive. This included closing all remaining privately owned shops and businesses and denouncing their owners as capitalist counter-revolutionaries. This experiment ultimately failed for reasons similar in some ways to the reasons the Chinese experiment failed. Among other things, the severe lack of consumer goods for purchase led productivity to decline, as large sectors of the population felt little incentive to work hard because they didn't have things that they could buy. What was required before communism as a world stage could be established was the complete evolution of socialism into a higher level. This meant that communist ideological domination of the tripartite Marx model of social existence had to be established. At the base of society is the relationship between advanced industrial means of production and a corresponding system of social relations and production. That in the superstructure, a communist ideological consciousness predominates. In other words, communist consciousness is not simply a matter of social leadership's will, but of having the prerequisite industrial preparation that Marxist-Leninist theory depended upon for the construction of communism as a socio-cultural stage. That was that the servitude epic social structure of any country could not be simply set aside by wishing it gone. The years 1969 to 1974 witnessed Cuba publicly celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Free Territory of the Americas, as the rebel base called itself in January of '69. In Fidel's celebratory speech, he warned of sugar rationing, reflecting the nation's economic problems. The 1969 sugarcane crop had been heavily damaged by a hurricane, and to meet the export quota, the government drafted in the Army, implemented a 7-day working week, and postponed public holidays to lengthen the harvest. When that year's production quota failed, Fidel offered to resign. Millions of people rose up, and masses descended upon the capital. As far as they were concerned, the sugar dislocation issue was insignificant compared to the revolution's achievements in the all-important social arena. In short, the Cuban people overwhelmingly supported Fidel's leadership in the achievements of the revolution in education, medical care, housing, and road construction, as well as the policies of direct democratic public consultation. From 1970 to '72, Soviet economists helped reorganize the Cuban economy. The Cuban-Soviet Commission of Economic, Scientific, and Technical Collaboration resulted. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin visited in 1971. In July 1972, Cuba joined the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMECON, which had been just the USSR and East European People's Democracies' Central Economic Organization. Now Cuba joined and began to specialize in what it had been traditionally strongest at, meaning sugarcane production and sugar manufacture. Although this meant less emphasis on what the rebel base had wanted, which was to make Cuba a manufacturing and industrial center, it did ensure financial stability for the near future. The 1970s saw the rise of two new guerrilla organizations in Guatemala. The rebel base area in Cuba intervened to unite the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, EGP, and the Organization of the People in Arms, ORPA. Then the United Insurgency began guerrilla attacks that included urban and rural warfare directed against the military. The CIA and its puppet Guatemalan Army and paramilitary forces responded with brutal counterinsurgency campaigns that resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths. In 1979, the U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who had until then been providing public support for the government forces, ordered a ban on all military aid to the Guatemalan Army as the genocide began to leak into the U.S. cap press. But this was just to pacify the U.S. public outcry, and documents have since come to light that prove the U.S. CIA continued its subversive intervention throughout the Carter years. In May 1970, the crews of two Cuban fishing boats were kidnapped by a Florida-based CIA front group called Alpha 66. Alpha 66 demanded that Cuba release its captured saboteurs. The Cuban fishing boat hostages the CIA held as Alpha 66 prisoners were released, and Fidel welcomed them back home as heroes. In April of '71, Cuba ordered the arrest of the counter-revolutionary Alberto Padilla. Padilla was freed after the government established the National Cultural Council to ensure that intellectuals and artists told and represented the truth about the revolution. In 1971, Fidel visited Chile, where Marxist President Salvador Allende had been elected as the head of a left-wing coalition. Castro supported Allende's socialist reforms, but warned him of right-wing elements in Chile's military. He gave him a machine gun to remind him that the DGI, the General Direction of Intelligence in Cuba, knew that a right-wing plot to overthrow his government was in the works. Apparently, Allende chose to ignore the intelligence and Fidel's personal warning. This led the empire in its striking back across South America to launch a military coup d'etat, establishing a fascist military junta led by Augusto Pinochet in Chile in 1973. This was the beginning of a CIA-sponsored fascist coups in South America. These would soon spread to Peru, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. In all cases, the CIA pulled out foci of fascism it had been fostering in these countries for many years. Meanwhile, the rebel base area carries on. Fidel proceeded to Guinea to meet Socialist President Sékou Touré, praising him as Africa's greatest leader, and there received the Order of Fidelity to the People. Fidel then went on a 7-week tour visiting allies in Algeria, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and the German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. Back in the USSR for the third time, Fidel was given further awards. On each trip, he was eager to visit factory and farm workers, publicly praising their governments. Privately, he urged these popular governments to copy the Cuban example and step up their aid to revolutionary movements in other countries, particularly in supporting the Vietnamese in fighting U.S. imperialism. In September 1973, Fidel returned to Algiers to attend the 4th summit of the non-aligned movement. A few NAM members who were just U.S. clients, posing to their own people as non-aligned, were made by their gringo masters to issue statements critical of Fidel's attendance, ignoring his founding role of the non-aligned movement, claiming that Cuba was aligned to the Warsaw Pact and therefore should not be at the conference. However, these were seen for what they were, and the NAM ignored them. At the conference, Cuba publicly broke off relations with Israel, citing its government's close relationship with the U.S. and its treatment of Palestinians during the Israel-Palestine conflict. This earned Cuba respect throughout the Arab world, in particular from the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who became Cuba's friend and ally. Cuban troops to Syria. As the Yom Kippur War broke out in October '73 between Israel and an Arab coalition led by Egypt and Syria, Cuba sent 4,000 troops to defend Syrian territory from Israeli incursions. Leaving Algiers, Castro visited Iraq and North Vietnam. Cuba's Comecon membership pays off. Cuba's economy grew in 1974 because of high international sugar prices and Cuba's specialization role in the socialist camped sugar production. Furthermore, Cuba had new banking credit with Argentina, Canada, and parts of Western Europe. The Gringo blockade shows fissures. A number of Latin American states called for Cuba's readmittance into the Organization of American States, the OAS. The U.S. finally conceded in 1975 on Henry Kissinger's watch. Cuba's government underwent a restructuring along Soviet lines, claiming that this would further democratization and decentralize power. Officially announcing Cuba's identity as a socialist state, the first National Congress of the Cuban Communist Party was held and a new constitution adopted that abolished the position of president and prime minister. Castro remained the dominant figure in governance, taking the presidency of the newly created Council of State and Council of Ministers, making him both head of state and head of government. The Cuban army defeats the South African army in 1975. Cuban leaders knew that Africa was the weakest link in the imperialist global empire. At the request of Angolan President Agostinho Neto, Fidel ordered 230 military advisors into southern Africa in November 1975 to aid Neto's MPLA in the Angolan Civil War. When the U.S. and South Africa stepped up their support of opposition to the opposition, FLNA and UNITA, Cuba sent 18,000 troops to Angola. These mixed-race, male and female soldiers decisively defeated the South African army, then intervening under U.S. CIA command. I recall a dramatic photograph of a platinum-blonde young Cuban woman going into the attack alongside black Cuban soldiers. These Cuban foreign fighters forced a South African retreat. 11 years ago, when I visited Cuba, I rented an apartment from one of these Angolan veterans who told me that Fidel had met with him and the other members of the expeditionary force in civilian clothes at the Havana airport the night they departed secretly for Angola. Fidel explained that they would go into uniform once they arrived in Luanda, and that the Soviet Union had pre-positioned their tanks and artillery, as well as their units' weaponry, and that it only awaited their arrival. After the Cuban victory over the South African Army, Fidel traveled to Angola and celebrated with Neto. He went on to meet with Sekou Touré and Guinea-Bissau President Luis Cabral. All agreed to support Mozambique's Marxist-Leninist government against the CIA's construct called Renamo in the Mozambique Civil War. Fidel went on to visit Algeria and then Libya, where he spent 10 days with Colonel Gaddafi. He was able to witness the establishment of the Gaddafi Jamahiriya system of governance before he attended talks with the Marxist government of South Yemen. From there, he proceeded to Somalia, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Angola, where he was greeted by crowds as a hero for Cuba's role in opposing apartheid South Africa and defeating the extension of apartheid forces into Angola. Throughout Africa, Fidel was hailed as a friend to national liberation from foreign dominance. Cuba at war in the Horn of Africa, 1977. In 1977, the Ethiopia-Somalia War broke out over the disputed Ogaden region. This war started when Somalia invaded Ethiopia. Cuba had been allied with Somalia President Siad Barre. Fidel had warned Siad Barre against such action. Now, Cuba sided with Mengistu Haile Mariam's Marxist government of Ethiopia. Cuba sent troops under the command of General Arnaldo Ochoa to aid the overwhelmed Egyptian army. In the greatest tank battle since Kursk, the Cuban Expeditionary Force defeated the invading force. The U.S. CIA had provided Somalia with the huge tank force they had used to invade Ethiopia. Meanwhile, in another great airlift similar to the one they had used to pre-position tank forces in Angola, they sent tanks to Ethiopia for the arriving Cuban volunteers to get into. After forcing back the Somalis, Mengistu then ordered the Ethiopians to suppress the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, a measure that Cuba refused to support. The U.S. officially complained that Cuba had no right to intervene in these African nations. Fidel, speaking for the Cuban nation, responded that Angola and Ethiopia had asked Cuba military assistance. Fidel pointed out that the U.S. did this all the time in various foreign nations all over the world. Victory in Nicaragua. Fidel extended support to the Sandinista National Liberation Front in its war against the U.S. stooge Anastasio Somoza Debayle in Nicaragua, as we discussed before, and we also discussed it in 1979. The rebels in Nicaragua were successful. In 1979, the Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement was held in Havana. Fidel Castro was elected as the NAM president, a position he held until 1982. In his capacity as both president of the NAM and president of Cuba, he appeared at the United Nations General Assembly in October '79 and gave a speech on the disparity between the world's rich and poor, in which he said, quote, "There is often talk of human rights, but it is also necessary to talk of the rights of humanity. Why should some people walk barefoot so that others can travel in luxurious cars? Why should some live for 35 years so that others can live for 70 years? Why should some be miserably poor so that others can be hugely rich? I speak on behalf of the children of the world who do not have a piece of bread. I speak on the behalf of the sick who have no medicine, of those whose rights to life and human dignity have been denied." Unquote. This speech to the General Assembly in 1979 at the United Nations was greeted with much applause from other world leaders. And Fidel supported the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Cuba's relations across North America improved. Mexican President Luis Echeverria desperately needed to pacify the angry Mexican left after the Tlatelolco massacre, so he stepped up his friendly relations with Cuba. Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and U.S. President Jimmy Carter adopted more respectful tones. and Fidel considered Carter well-meaning and sincere. Cuba freed some prisoners and allowed some Cuban exiles to visit relatives on the island. Fidel hoped that in turn Carter would abolish the economic embargo and stop CIA subversion. However, that did not happen and would not until many U.S. presidents later. Meanwhile, in 1980 in Guatemala, on January 31st, a group of the indigenous Quiche people took over the Spanish embassy to protest the CIA Guatemalan Army massacre in the countryside. The CIA directed the Guatemalan government to launch an assault with its armed forces and police that killed almost everybody inside the Spanish embassy by setting a fire that consumed the building. The Spanish ambassador who survived the fire said the Guatemalan police invaded the embassy and intentionally killed almost everyone inside and then set it on fire to erase traces of their acts. Consequently, the government of Spain broke diplomatic relations with Guatemala. Despite all his great achievements, Fidel has a weak spot, namely his knowledge of Soviet history and the then current fight for a revolutionary line in the international communist movement. Conversely, Fidel's relationship with China declined as he, 1. accused Deng Xiaoping's Chinese government of betraying their revolutionary principles by initiating trade links with the U.S., and 2. attacking Vietnam. In the former case, we can see that Fidel's knowledge of Soviet history and the new economic policy and its role in the first decade of Soviet power was lacking. What the Chinese were doing was returning to the 1920s Leninist policy of two systems under proletarian dictatorship. The problem with Vietnam was that the Chinese were angry about Vietnamese interference with the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia. Chinese leadership saw this as the Soviet Union opposing revolution everywhere, and in this case in Cambodia, then called Kampuchea. Again, Fidel's knowledge and understanding of the internal fight in the international communist movement proved to be his weak point. At any rate, from 1980 to 1990, U.S. imperialism was on the rampage globally. Cuba fought back, and modern revisionism collapsed at the end of 1990. Cuba's economy was in trouble after the decline in the international market prices for sugar and 1979's drought-damaged harvest. Unemployment became a problem again for Cuba. The Comecon membership ameliorated what might have been a crisis for Cuba, because as a member of Comecon, Cuba could send young people to associated countries to work. Many went to the German Democratic Republic. The pressure of supporting non-working persons who preferred to remain idle and live off government welfare subsidies, such as Tony Montana and friends, was relieved by the government's encouragement for them to emigrate to Florida. Oliver Stone's movie Scarface starts out with this speech of Fidel's, who said, "These grumbling enemies of the revolution were, quote, not needed, not wanted," unquote. Thousands of counter-revolutionary petty bourgeoisie, having refused to join the revolution, who preferred the U.S. propaganda version of life in Miami, exited Cuba from the Cuban port town of Mariel. Which is just north of Havana, and now it's turned into a great big entry port thanks to Chinese investment. But at any rate, at this time, Mariel was a kind of a small port just north of Havana. They were taken to Miami. These people had left from there by hundreds of boats that arrived from the Gusano community in the U.S. A mass exodus of 120,000 ensued, and it would not be until the Cuban crime wave hit the newspapers and electronic media in Florida that Floridians would realize why Cuba's government didn't want all these criminals and mentally corrupted people around at home. The Mariel exodus was one more thing leading to Jimmy Carter's defeat in 1981 by the right-wing Republican Ronald Reagan, who was elected U.S. president. Reagan's administration adopted a hardline approach against Cuba, making the U.S. desire to overthrow the Cuban government clear. In late 1981, Fidel publicly accused the U.S. of biological warfare against Cuba by orchestrating a dengue fever epidemic. When I visited Cuba 11 years ago, this topic was being discussed on the Cuban Roundtable television show, which is on every night in Cuba. The rebel base intervening in Guatemala. Meanwhile, the pariah regime in Guatemala, although internationally condemned, received considerable support from the Reagan administration and Reagan himself described the chief criminal Rios Montt as a man of great personal integrity. Rios Montt was overthrown by General Oscar Humberto Mejia Victores, who called for the election of a national constitutional assembly to write a new constitution, leading to a free election in 1986, which was won by Vinicio Cerezo Arevalo, the candidate of the Christian Democracy Party. The Guatemalan insurgency needed help and had sent a delegation to the rebel base in Cuba. The Cubans responded, sending DGI agents to get the Guatemalan freedom fighters up to speed. Now, in 1982, there were 4 guerrilla groups in Guatemala: EGP, ORPA, FAR, and PGT. These were merged and formed the URNG. The Cubans brought with them assistance from brother Central American freedom fronts, including experienced fighters from the El Salvadoran guerrilla FMLN, the Nicaraguan FSLN, as well as Cuba's own volunteers. This intervention made the Guatemalan rebels unstoppable. As a result of the Army's scorched earth tactics in the countryside, more than 45,000 Guatemalans had fled across the border to Mexico. The Mexican government placed the refugees in camps in Chiapas and Tabasco. The newly reorganized Guatemalan resistance began repatriating them and building a mixed-sex army of dedicated and educated fighters. The Guatemalan Revolution was now invincible. Well, this government was overthrown in 1983, the one in Guatemala, and General Efrain Rios Montt was named president of the military junta. He continued the bloody campaign of torture, forced disappearances, and scorched earth warfare that had made Guatemala into a pariah state. I'm going to stop here because we're running out of time, and we are at any rate about to the point where we can move on to the next lecture on Guatemala. I'm going to go through a little bit more about the Guatemalan Civil War from this chapter and the New Jewel movement in Grenada, which ended up in another U.S. invasion of that island, and then the onset of the great traitor Gorbachev and his fight with Fidel Castro. And then we'll move right into the Guatemalan fight for communism in the last 50 years in lecture number 30.